Okay, so it seems that Todd and I had a conversation about what to present, because what I'm going to talk to you about is the natural continuation of Todd's excellent presentation. So, but there is something that is kind of important when we talk about different forms of more modern slavery, is that we are dealing with ignorance, and there is one justification for my ignorance, is that this is the beginning of a big project. So this is the advantage of having a conference at the beginning of a project. You can justify that you don't know much, but you will after the project, and we hope that is gonna happen. But we are also talking, as Todd mentioned, in a way, underlining his presentation, is that we are dealing with a crime, and a terrible crime. And that imposes constraints on how much we can know about it. So in a way, being researchers of this fascinating, even though it's very painful object of study, is carrying out a sort of police work as well. So we are dealing with ignorance, and there's very little what we know in the absence of the good data. But Todd's presentation gave us hope. So there is things we can learn, and there is forms of slavery that we can identify and give and trying to carry out some meaningful, even if imperfect, some meaningful analysis. And what I want to do with my presentation is to share some knowledge that we've been creating with Todd and other researchers on the effects of forced labor and international trade, with the idea that international trade is very well connected and in a way has similar effects. At least we should expect similar effects of the effects we could expect from investment. So in a way, I'm being a bit cheeky here, and I'm gonna talk. So the things we know about the effects of international trade, with the hope that this knowledge also translates into the knowledge on the final knowledge we will have after this project on the effects of investment on forced labor. Okay, so that's the strong assumption underlying my presentation. So it's about trade, but hopefully it's also about investment. Okay, so the motivation is it's impossible. It's no point in repeating the motivation here. So it is something that is attracting a lot of political attention. Many millions of people are suffering from this, and it's increasingly important to deal with it. And there are some doubts about the effects. So there are people who consider that different forms of globalization are enhancing the use of forced labor or different forms of modern slavery. And this is not only generating arguments against globalization per se, but it's also requesting a more kind of maybe constructive way of reaction, is trying to impose anti-slavery policy proposals in any negotiation of trade or investment in order to prohibit the circulation of goods produced using slave labor. So reducing the incentives and trying to monitor and reducing and enforce practices against using forced labor. When you're talking about globalization reduces or increases the incentive for using forced labor, well, something that is very important, you are a researcher, more than if you are a politician or a policy maker, but it's equally important for policymakers. Ultimately, they are those who are fighting it, is identifying causality. So you can identify many objects in social sciences. You can see that there is a link between these two objects, even a link that suggests some sequence in a way that one can generate the other, but that means nothing in a way, because what we need is to identify a causal link between, in this case, trade liberalization or globalization and the use of slave labor in order to justify this demand, or in order to give empirical support to these demands and feelings against or in favor of globalization. So what do we know is what I'm gonna talk about now, and what we can know in a way is what Todd talked about already, but it's gonna be underlying my presentation all the time. Okay, so what is exactly what we are doing here? We are talking about forced labor. So forced labor is only one of many forms of modern slavery, but it's an important one. So according to the Walk Free Foundation, 40 million people were victims of modern slavery in 2016. 62% were in the category of forced labor. But there are also different forms of forced labor. One is obviously the one that it's very well. All of them are very dramatic. Now there is not category. There is not a hierarchy of pain, but about 20% is sexual exploitation. 17% is imposed by the governments. And what we are basically looking at is forced labor that happens in markets, and in a way they're hidden to the police and the researchers, but they are in a way responding to market forces. So one of the many challenges is, first of all, understanding the different channels, theoretical channels, and also identifying the data in order to capture exactly what we talk about in this case, which is forced labor. The other is that we know that obviously there is variation in the prevalence of forced labor and also the proportion of forced labor over other forms of modern slavery. This varies across the world, across different regions, and this is an element to bear in mind, because if there is variation in something, there is hope for changing. Okay, because in principle there's no reason why the prevalence of forced labor should vary across different countries if there were not forces that we could identify. The same, the use of forced labor takes place in different sectors, so begging, mining, personal services. So there is a variety of sectors where you can identify some use of forced labor, and we need to find data to look at this at that level. So many challenges, but we are already identifying things. Based on ongoing long project we are having with Todd and other colleagues from the University of Leicester and Uruguay, we've been working on this for already 2 years, more or less, or even more. I'm going to make the assumption that trade and investment trigger qualitatively isomorphic effects. So, because in a way, so you think about these two ways to engage in globalization from the perspective of a country. These two forces trigger similar pro-competition effects. So engaging in trade, receiving investment generates more competition. Competition, depending on the type of good and the type of and source of competitive and the source of market power, this could in a way generate more incentive to increase the use of forced labor. So, and this is something that we need to take about, we need to talk about, understand better, and this is perhaps behind the idea that globalization is a problem if we want to fight this particular form of modern slavery. But also, trade and investment generates income, and these income effects, if they are positive, could in a way reduce or generate conditions for fighting for forced labor, but also generates more incentive to appropriate a bigger pie. So I would say, in principle, the effects of income on forced labor is ambiguous. But at the same time, and these are the kind of the optimistic side, we'll emphasize that engaging with the world generate the possibility for introducing tighter regulations and controls, and this is a potential action that one can use in order to fight forced labor. So different channels, multiple directions. The data is not perfect, and the reality is partly hidden. So this is the mess. So this is the challenge. So that's what makes this task so fascinating, but at the same time so challenging. And when you have, in principle, you have in theory different potential and opposing effects of anything on anything, the answer is mainly empirical. Okay, so because you cannot assign in theory a weight to each of the mechanisms that go in different directions. So that's why we need to carry out an empirical work. So, and the same you could say about investment. For example, if you're talking about foreign FDI, investors may seek, they don't care much about the population in the receiving country, and they might care about reducing labor costs. Well, if you're thinking about reducing labor costs, you're thinking about particular type of goods that use labor intensively. Fine, you have to bear that in mind. And these investors, they have no accountability, and they don't need to care about respecting human rights in the receiving country of the investment. And countries obviously enter in competition for investment, and this could trigger a race to the bottom in the sense of with respect to human rights standards. So these are the channels that could make you think that there's a problem with the way these investment agreements are set up, and it's basically what is in mind of the policymakers, I hope, and actually it is, because we observe an increasing use of commitments in the different agreements, and that's what we're going to investigate over this year. So, and again, facilitating economic development in a way could generate conditions for raising human rights standards. In a way, similar to trade. Why? That's my point. Todd show a similar graph. A similar figure about the relationship between a form of globalization. In this case, this is importance of trade over GDP for each country, and a measure of modern slavery victims per 1,000 people. And you just put for each country, you have a number, and then just run a correlation. You can introduce controls or not. And this correlation will give you a positive view. And this is the one that, this is a similar view that was presented by Todd. It seems that more openness will reduce the use of modern slavery slightly, but in a significant way. So this is behind an optimist view. However, if you look at different regions, this is no longer true, and you can see, and this is just correlations, okay? So this is the least demanding form of knowledge, okay? So this is something that you could ask only your second-year students to talk about. So, but if you do this across different regions, then you see that the relationship varies across regions, and this is important. So it seems to be very negatively associated with trade is very negatively associated with modern slavery in Africa, but it's increasing or is associated with higher levels of modern slavery in the Americas. So I'm talking about the Americas. I'm from South America. I'm almost offended by that term, but so I'm talking about South American countries and Central American countries. Negative in Arab states, and zero in Asia and Europe. And zero is when you see that is not significant and the relationship is slightly negative or almost zero. So this is the first element to bear in mind. Whatever you're talking about, the effects of trade or investment, this is going to vary across regions. But also, we are talking about two objects, trade and modern slavery, and both depend on many things that are common. The type of government, the type of the geography, the type of the specialization, what these countries produce. So these two things, these elements affects both trade and modern slavery. So any relationship you establish through correlations or even regressions between these two things are meaningless, in the sense that it could be that there is something behind explaining the variation of these two and explaining the form of the variation, either in a positive way or negative way or whatever. So, and this is what we call endogeneity problem. So whenever you're facing a relationship that is suffering from endogeneity, in a way you can mention the correlation, but you're not being 100% honest, and for sure you cannot make any assessment based on correlations. One way to fight about the problem of endogeneity is to create exogenous to look for exogenous determinants of one of the elements of the relationship. So in this case, we want to study the effect of trade on forced labor. Let's try to predict how much trade is determined by aspects that are not correlated or they are not related with the use of forced labor. So, and in trade, in the trade literature, we use a form of predicting what is exogenous about the trade relationship between two countries that depends on the country's geography. And we need to assume that these aspects of the geography that are used in order to predict the level of trade between two countries is not correlated with the use of forced labor. Okay? And if you convince the reader and your referees and the community that you found a way to predict trade using determinants that are not used or they are not affecting the other object of study, in this case modern slavery, you can be more comfortable about making causality claims. Okay, because in this case, if you accept this assumption, trade would affect slavery only through the impact of total trade flows. So if it's increasing or decreasing based on the exogenous sources of trade. Okay, I'm not so. If there's any question, I can come back to this. In a way, I just wanted to show the results, because once you have one measure that is cleaner of globalization, in this case, an instrumented measure of trade over GDP, then the correlation has a flavor of causality, and then you can be a little bit more comfortable about making the claim of trade affecting the use of forced labor. And this is just an equation for those who don't care about the equations. In a way, what we want is to know the sign and the value of beta 1. Beta 1 is in a way is measuring or estimating how this independent variable, now more independent because it's instrumented, affects the use of forced labor. And then, obviously, this relationship could be affected and shaped by many other aspects, and this is what we call controls. So in the work we taught, we use a variety of controls, measuring the effect of geography and demographic factors. So population density could in a way could be affecting the type of production and also the type of access to people. So it could be affecting both your relationship with other countries through trade and the use of forced labor. Then in the case of trade, the presence of FDI. But also we need to fight crime, and to fight crime we need a voice. So when we need voice, we need political institutions that allow for different voices to be expressed and to exert pressure. So and the quality of domestic political institutions also matters to understand the relationship with, actually it matters for understand the relationship of anything on forced labor, and hence the relationship between anything on modern slavery. So we use different measures of democracy, the existence of or not of political repression. We know that civil conflicts is a trigger for a more extensive use of forced labor. The type of regime will establish the capacity of any regime to fight crime, in this case, the crime we are talking about, that is concerned by this research, and the international institutional context, which is one of the main aspects of our general project. So preferential trade agreements or investment agreements impose conditionalities aiming at reducing the use of forced labor, and we need to understand whether these conditionalities are effective or not. And this is what we want to understand. So here, until now, I've been ignorant because it's very difficult what we are studying. This is ignorance just because we started the project. Okay, so, but in any case, you need to control for this. When you just run this analysis and you control for these factors, you learn some things, and this is what we know. And I want to mention some statements we can make. I wouldn't say that we can be 100% sure about these statements, but we can at least honestly claim that is quite possible. Okay, so the correlation between trade forced labor is negative. When you control for endogeneity, then this relationship disappears, as if there was no direct relationship between international trade and the use of forced labor. And we could stop here. Basically, there's no relationship, fine. However, we know now, we knew from looking at the correlations, but this is now in a way confirmed by our analysis, that this relationship varies across the regions. More trade causes less intense use of forced labor in America, in the Americas, sorry, and Arab states, but more in Asia Pacific region. And so this relationship between trade and forced labor appears to be disconnected in general, but we know now that it is conditionally associated with each other, and the conditions, also the factors that are conditioning this relationship are the type of region, the trading partners. So it's not the same trading with a country that doesn't show a lot of care or concern about the use of forced labor, that countries that are whose societies are asking them to fight this in other countries. So trading partners matter, and also the type of products involved, because in the end, if using forced labor is like the result of a rational decision in a way where you're the slaveholder is pondering the risk of being caught and captured and the benefits of using cheap labor. Well, so we would expect that this is more important for products that are using labor more intensively. So products for which actually we need to have these people working, and if you can have them working for free, regardless of your moral concerns, you would do it. Okay, so these are the factors that are conditioning the relationship, and I also expect that these are the factors that are also conditioning the relationship between investment and the use of forced labor. And then a battery of results. Trade appears as reducing the incidence of forced labor in non-OECD countries when trading to OECD countries. So the OECD countries are playing a positive role. For the American and Arab countries, trade appears to be reducing forced labor in all the specifications. So for these countries, it's relatively positive to be engaged in trade. In Asia Pacific, trade appears to be increasing the incidence of forced labor in all the specifications. And this makes sense because these are countries that are exporting products that are mainly are using labor more intensively than, for example, the exports of countries like in Arab countries or American countries that are more based on natural resources. So this is already telling you something about the relationship and the channels through which one could affect the other. So Asia Pacific is in a way engaging in trade with other countries is going to increase the use of forced labor, but except when we consider trade again with OECD countries. For non-OECD, Europe, Central Asia countries, the channels through which trade is affecting forced labor is mainly products that are using unskilled labor increasingly, as we would expect. So you have these conditions. What could be behind this? If you want to emphasize something more general, taking stock of these results and seeing the effect of the OECD, this is suggesting something, right? So why the OECD engaging in trade with OECD countries will affect forced labor in a way that is going to reduce modern slavery in the trading countries. Well, so let's try to see something behind this that is common, and this seems to be the labor standards of the trading partners. So when you're considering countries with high labor rights, engaging with trade with these countries, no matter whether they are part of the OECD or not, well, so trade is reducing the use of forced labor. When you're trading with countries, according to the International Labour Organization, have low levels of labor rights, then trade is producing a more extensive use of forced labor. And this is key, and this is important. It's also a source of hope in the sense that affecting our own laws, and exerting pressure on our own countries could also reduce the use of forced labor in other countries. So preliminary reflections and next steps. Okay, so the link between trade, investment, and forced labor is complex and requires more understanding. Okay, so sorry I wasted your time to reach this conclusion. You knew that from the beginning. We need to understand the effect of changes in the extent and nature of trade and investment to go beyond correlations and be able to assess their dynamic effects. Because what matters most is at the current moment, increasing or decreasing the engagement in trade or investment, international investment would have a positive or negative effect, and this is not captured by correlations. Is it true that international trade and investment have similar effects? In theory, I think it is true, but we need to dig so to understand this better. And the fact that the results depend on the nature and the level of labor rights in trading partners supports the idea that conditionalities in different agreements might work. And this is why we are doing this project. So studying the content of agreements is a way forward to see how engaging with the rest of the world, either through trade or through receiving investment, can reduce the use of forced labor. And this is where I stop. So thank you very much.